Okay, hi there. My name is, I'm one of these people that's kind of crazy. I like starting on time, but I have to, now this is not to embarrass my speaker, but we have the rockingest excuse for her being late. With her low carbon transport of a bicycle, the tire fell off. Yes?
The wheel.
The wheel fell off. And so she was, but that's okay. I actually used that excuse when I decided to walk to a meeting way past DuPont Circle, and I said, low carbon tardiness? Yeah. So anyway, but this is good. You all had time to get settled, comfortable, finding the right seat with the correct feng shui in the audience. I'd like to welcome you to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I think all of you are old hats at coming here, but it's always nice to remind you, in case you have forgotten, that the Wilson Center was created in 1968 by Congress to bring the scholarly and policy communities together around, well, initially, around foreign policy issues. And I think that in the many years that we've been here, we've gone from being regionally focused to very specialized in country and topics. And I direct the China Environment Forum, where I've been for 10 years, putting on meetings, putting out publications, doing research exchanges focused on energy and environmental issues in China. And least I forget. Asia Program is our co-sponsor for this meeting. There's Bryce there, who was the one that kind of lured you all here from his list. I'm very excited that you are coming. I mean, I'm going to use the word exciting a lot today because I am excited. Not only because we got the speakers here, but also that that Copenhagen is coming down the pike. I know that people like my speakers here who work, Jennifer in particular, who works on climate issues for WRI, is probably quite tired. A lot of issues coming there, but it's also quite exciting for those of us that focus on energy and environmental issues in China. President Obama is, I think, probably just leaving China. A lot of signature action. As we were sleeping last night, I haven't even had a chance to go through all of the documents yet, and you either. But it appears that there are many new areas that the two President Hu and President Obama committed to for U.S.-China energy cooperation, which is highly relevant to today's talks. We have two panels today. We're focusing in on Northeast Asia, on the path to Copenhagen. And I'm responsible for the first panel, which is China, as you can guess, since I am the China Environment Forum. Not alone, I've got my assistant Pete wandering around here somewhere as well. Those of you here know clearly that East Asian nations are going to play a significant role in the upcoming Copenhagen talks. It's not just about China. I mean, I'm the China-obsessed one, but there are other countries other nations in Northeast Asia that matter. And so we're starting off with China. And then we're going to have a panel. Asia program will give the fuller introduction, but it's called Green Tigers, ? See, mine was Green Revolution in China. There was no question mark there. And it's focused on Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea vis-a-vis Copenhagen. And I'm going to let Bryce do the intro of his wonderful speakers. I've got mine. I almost have mine. The other one is on the way, too. I wonder if we had another tire malfunction. This we'll see. But we're going to start off, we'll switch the order slightly, but we're going to start off with Jennifer Morgan, who, as I mentioned, is at World Resources Institute. She directs the Climate and Energy Program. I think it's perhaps the biggest team at WRI. Could be right. Yeah, it is. She used to come from a somewhat, quieter but busier kind of organization, E3G. She was based in Berlin for a long time, and she was their global climate director, and she focused most of her time bringing on EU, China, and the U.S., but a lot on EU-China energy cooperation. And so I like telling you this. You have the bio, but it's important to know the kinds of questions that you can ask her later. And one little factoid, besides that she rides a bike, is that I'd forgotten that you and I are similar in that we both studied German as undergrads. Right. So naturally, we now work in the environmental sphere. I don't know how that came. Now, hopefully she'll be coming up shortly. But Taiya Smith, she's the senior associate at Carnegie Energy and Climate Program and the Carnegie China Program, and she's going to hopefully be coming after Jennifer here. Jennifer's going to start off. Because I don't know, maybe you have overload, but I think it's really hard for those of us with all the newspapers and things going on in the news. What is really happening in the run-up to Copenhagen in terms of the status of the talks, and what is China's position? And that's Jennifer's goal today, to make that clear to us. Taiya is going to talk about some of the political drivers that are kind of shaping China's position towards Copenhagen, kind of going down to a lower level, looking at some of more of their current renewable energy and other programs that are hopefully that they feel are leading them on a low carbon path. You've got Taiya's bio, and it's kind of similar to Jennifer's in that she's also spent quite many years on international negotiations, not all in environment. Most recently, she worked for Treasury under Secretary Hank Paulson, And as part of her job, she managed the Secretary's relationship with China. Most notably, many of you who look at China know about, it was used to be called the Strategic Economic Dialogue. And it laid out a framework, a 10-year framework for energy and environment, which I believe was really the foundation for all these agreements and plans that were signed just yesterday in China. So, and then last but not least, but he may end up being second, seeing how whatever happens to Taiya, is that we want to give the audience a taste of China's rapid development of clean energy technology and its commercialization. And he was added late because it just kind of ends up that Matt Lewis, who flew out here from San Francisco, he works for the Climate Works Foundation, and he's a director of communications. And he just got back a few weeks ago. It's amazing that you did this so quickly. Putting together some very short films on clean tech development in China, looking at wind and solar and, well, I guess we don't usually think of cement as clean tech, but the potential of cleaning it up was part of the angle for him there. And he's going to make some comments because he's really most recently from on the ground in China. And would kind of build on some of the trends that, we hear about the policy trends in China that the government's trying to lead, but him talking a little bit where the industry is actually going. So he's going to show like a really mini, and I mean mini, 4-minute documentary on the wind power sector and give us a little bit of, I think, rampant anecdotalism on wind power sector in China. So Taiya has come.
Apologies. With
apologies, don't worry. Jennifer was right in front of you, but we're cool. We're going to start off, Jennifer, I will do PowerPoint clicky thingies, and you can come on up here and wow them. And your job in the audience is to listen attentively, think of hard questions. The speakers will be kept, I'm kind of strict that way, to 20 minutes per person at most. Okay, I think I got it here.
All set? Great. All right, 20 minutes. Good afternoon. Great to be here and see some colleagues, old friends in the audience. I am going indeed to try and walk you through kind of where we are going into the Copenhagen meeting more on a global level, and then spend some time on the formal Chinese position, but also move in perhaps to some of the areas that we heard announced yesterday and where things are looking. I think that this slide really just starts to give you a sense in a picture way of what the world's countries are trying to do at this point in time. You have, I don't have a roaming mic, but I'll just.
I can get you a roaming mic.
No, that's okay. So, if you look at the UN textual negotiations, you have Copenhagen Agreement in the middle. You have the textual negotiations, which are now at about 150 pages long of text. You have what we call managing these policy minds, which are things like competitiveness, verification, some really prickly issues that have both challenging national debates going on around them just on the national level, but then also internationally. That's great. And then you have... to move those things forward, you clearly have a set of national political conditions that are being built. So in the case, in each country, there is a discussion going on about how far we can go, what types of laws we're going to pass, what we can sign up to. Simultaneously, we are in the midst of the global political conditions after an APEC summit last weekend, a bilateral negotiation, U.S.-China, Ban Ki-moon flying around the world, Prime Minister Rasmussen from Denmark having his commitment circle of heads of state who are working to land a deal in Copenhagen. And I'll go into some of the elements of that. But I think it's important to see all of the details, but also these political conditions that are coming in. It's quite clear, and it's always been clear, that we're not going to get everything done in Copenhagen. This is an immensely complex negotiation. So you will have a follow-on of rulemaking, continuing bilateral negotiations into a final agreement and ratification. So lots of steps along the way. I think there is a question that often comes to mind: why have a global agreement? And I think the reason why countries are engaged in this and stakeholders is they see that there is an added value, clearly that you're ready to go further because you're part of a global agreement than maybe a country would have. That there is a high trust environment, that you trust that your competitors are going to be also moving towards a low carbon economy. that there is in the agreement a flexibility to go to deeper targets and deeper cuts based on the science coming in. And I think that there is a transformational change in OECD countries, and certainly a foundational one for future reductions in emerging economies. And I think that's what some key benchmarks are on the international level. If you look at what the key issues are that are being negotiated right now, I'll come back to these a little bit. You have a shared vision, which is, does the world want to stay below 2 degrees? Is there a threshold of impacts that is too high? What are the long-term emission reduction goals? And then a set of negotiations around mitigation and adaptation, where a big focus is on the developed country targets, equally on developing country actions, and those are very distinctly spelled out, that we're talking about targets for developed countries and actions for developing countries. A big package around technology, finance, and capacity building. Some of these developing country actions will be in the forestry field. And in the core of it is measuring, reporting, and verification. MRV, key acronym for the international climate negotiations, which I think has also been a key topic that was negotiated overnight last night. Now, what is the form of this agreement going to be? And you've probably seen the media, we're going to get a politically binding agreement, no, we're going to get a legally binding agreement, we're not going to get an agreement. What are they talking about? I think that there are two options on the table, or two scenarios at this point in time. The first is that you do get a binding Copenhagen decision, which does have all the numbers in it. So it has numbers, reduction targets from developed countries, and it has most likely aims for the large developing countries and a set of policies and measures. In that decision, you have the basic financing framework, and you have a decision that we are going to have a legally binding agreement. Now, what you're hearing now in the media is, well, maybe we can't get it all done by Copenhagen because there are two tracks of negotiations, one under Kyoto and one under the UN, and it's very hard to pull those together. So one option that's being discussed is maybe you land all the substance in Copenhagen, you decide you're going to have a legally binding treaty, but you stop the clocks and you come back 6 months later to finish the deal because you realize that you can't quite get there. And developing countries want to see the numbers. They want to know what the United States is going to do to reduce its emissions. The Senate isn't done yet. So can we come forward in a way that gets some trust and some substance on the table that then can build the basis of trust for a final agreement, perhaps in June, or some say Mexico. I would rather have June. Mexico's a little far away. The second option is really a political declaration, which doesn't have any numbers or country commitments, and it's basically a very high-level political statement saying we're going to finish this in 6 to 12 months. This is not an optimal outcome if you're trying to move issues forward, but I think that they're still both on the table. Now, if I get to the key players, before I go into specifically on China, this graph shows you very roughly kind of a power matrix, less powerful and more powerful along the horizontal axis, and more supportive of 2 degrees, so how ambitious is a country, how unambitious is a country. And then you say, okay, well, who has to be in the room? Who has to be the deal maker at the end of the day? Well, those are these countries. That's obviously the United States and China. It's India, it's Japan, and it's the European Union. And you've seen I kind of separated those out between progressive and less progressive, but it's the EU. Then you have your deal breakers or your rogues who you might not be sure of where they're going to go. Clearly, Saudi Arabia and parts of OPEC are in that box. Russia is there because you're never sure what Russia wants until the ink is dry. And so they're always a bit of a wild card. You have a number of important swing states who can make a deal happen. But they're not the ones who will be in the room at the last moment. And you have some champions, and you'll see these are the countries that have very high ambition. These are the frontline countries. This is Africa, who threatened to walk out in the last negotiation because the targets weren't strong enough. These are the island nations. These are the ones who are the most ambitious, but also the least powerful. So there are efforts. I think they were trying to flex their muscle and show they're actually more powerful, because if they walk out in Copenhagen, there is no deal. So you can go then behind, you can kind of see each week. I look at this again. India, I'd say 3 weeks ago, was down here. India has moved up. Minister Ramesh and Prime Minister Singh are clearly in a space where they want India to play a proactive role. China and the U.S., where are they in there? Japan's election. I mean, I'm really interested in the next panel. I have South Korea here. I think yesterday they put even a stronger table on the target in Copenhagen. So, Japan has moved up since its election. So all of those kind of different pieces in the puzzle to see give you a sense of who is where. In this box, I think Australia sees itself as playing a key role. Indonesia, I might even move up a little bit here since its reduction target that it announced. Brazil also announced a reduction target last week. So you can see that everybody's really getting ready.
Floating bubbles.
Floating bubbles. They're all slowly going a bit more up to the top, but clearly a question of what's the U.S. Senate going to say and how does that relate? So if I go into 4 scenarios, and then I'll go into the kind of the Chinese perspective on this. I think we did these about 6 months ago, actually with E3G, of what could outcomes be. And I think that the top one is the one that all hope for, but is very challenging, which is you get the commitments and the targets to really know you're going to be below 2 degrees moving forward. Plus, you get the whole legal regime in place and all of the foundations. It's a long-term breakthrough agreement. The collapse is obviously just that. For a range of reasons, there's a collapse in Copenhagen. You can't bridge the differences, and you either defer everything into a COP bis, or just things break down. And I think probably where we are is somewhere now in between foundation and greenwash. A foundation agreement, in my mind, is one that has the institutions in place or on way to getting those institutions in place. It has a whole range of down payments on the table for the targets, but they're not ambitious enough yet, and we know they're not ambitious enough yet. But you have a credible foundation. The greenwash is basically everybody pledges what they're currently planning to do already and puts it into a registry. So it's not a lot of value added. Now, if you move into the Chinese formal position on Copenhagen, I think this was actually their position that came out last May, and I don't think they have formally moved at all on this. They're very clear that the Framework Convention and the Kyoto Protocol are the basis for negotiations. So folks who thought that there was going to be some U.S.-China deal in the bilateral on numbers, I never thought was going to happen, because I think China sees the UN framework as very important. It sees its allegiances to the G77 in China as very important. It sees Kyoto as a very important, long-living treaty, which is why there's this challenge on the legal instrument at the end of the day. The principle of common but differentiated responsibilities is absolutely essential. So that's why when positions are put on the table around having the same measuring, reporting, and verification systems for all major economies, there are some concerns that come in from the Chinese side saying, well, but where is the differentiation between what, say, the United States is doing and what China has to do? Or, right now the U.S. has said, well, we'll take on a binding target. You take on an intensity goal. That's differentiation, but is that enough differentiation for China? And they have been very, very active in the support piece of this. The funding, I'll do a little bit more on this, for mitigation, adaptation, technology, and finance. My sense is China is not expecting a lot of money itself, but it wants to make sure that Africa gets money. It wants to make sure that the G77 gets money. They've been very strong on targets, wanting 40% reduction targets below 1990 by 2020 for developed countries. And that their nationally appropriate mitigation actions, NAMAs as they're known, are not targets, but they're voluntarily initiated policies and measures. They're also not supposed to be for offsets, so they should be their own policies and measures. But as you all know, in New York, Hu Jintao said that they stated their intent to adopt a carbon intensity target of a notable margin, or a significant, depending on the translation that you heard. So there is an intent to come to Copenhagen and put a number on the table, and there's lots of discussions in Beijing about what those numbers might be. Very quickly, we did a bit of analysis of what's on the table now from developed countries to see, are you within anywhere close to the 25 to 40% range, the 40% that China is asking for and others. We found that if you add it all up, and there's lots of assumptions in here that you can see on our website, you get somewhere in between a 10% reduction below 1990 levels and a 24% reduction level below 1990 levels. So you're still away from the 25 to 40%, but you do see some significant pledges coming forward and countries ready to go further if they know others are ready to act. The debate around the developing countries, as you know, what's the baseline or the business as usual? What do they do on their own for domestic action? What kind of support do they get to go further? What kind of carbon market mechanisms are there? China has said very clearly that it will only register in an international registry the supported actions. And one of the big debates has been, if China puts an intensity target on the table, does that go into an international registry that is internationally verified or not? Key last minute, I think last night, issue on the table in Copenhagen. So this is kind of what I just said as far as the registry, but China has put forward that they would like new institutions and funding for adaptation, for technology, and for capacity building. They've put a financial ask on the table of 0.5 to 1% of GDP, of developed countries' GDP, to fill those funds. And they've clearly put out their position that they don't want any unilateral trade measures coming forward. This is just, they've done a lot of thinking on technology transfer and cooperation. And there's a very detailed proposal there that goes all the way through the innovation chain and shows how to move technologies along that road. There hasn't been a lot of developed country response, but major priority for China. And on this measuring, reporting, and verification issue, this MRV issue, I'd just say, the two issues are, what's the measuring, reporting, and verification system for the actions that developing countries are putting forward? Are they internationally verified or not? Does that count as binding or not? And what's the MRV for the support? So how do developing countries know that developed countries are actually going to be putting forward and fulfilling the commitments that they've said? And China's been very strong in making sure that both sides of those are indeed MRV'd. We did a workshop about 3 weeks ago in Beijing on measuring, reporting, and verification, or measuring, assessment, and evaluation in China with Tsinghua University, because we wanted to get a better sense of what the current capacity is in China to measure, report, and verify, because this has become such a big issue in the negotiations. And what our Chinese colleagues found is that actually a strong MAE system is consistent with domestic interests, because the Chinese government wants to know whether it's meeting its own national 11th five-year goals or not. And they have a very elaborate system put in place in order to make sure that they can track what's happening nationally. And I think that it's very important that whatever system is put in place really matches with what the policy options are in country. So if you've got a set of policies and measures, as you do in China, then it makes more sense that your MAE system matches that rather than putting a carbon market mechanism in place, right? So that it's very important that it underpins and supports the existing options that are being discussed in country. And that there is a range of capacity building that's needed as far as legislation, infrastructure, quality control, and a dynamic assessment and information disclosure piece. And that there is, you can go through and quite clearly look at what kind of capacity is needed and how could you move so that China felt more comfortable that it could actually commit to internationally verifying things. I will just close with a few observations about the summit. Which, I guess my conclusions here is that Copenhagen, it's still all to play for. All of the substance is still on the table. There's 40 heads of state signed up to go. President Obama has said he'll go if he sees that there's a role for him there. And both presidents yesterday indicated the importance that they put towards this meeting. And all major economies are putting these serious proposals on the table. So there is a timing issue with the U.S., which maybe we can talk about in the Q&A. But my real sense on the Chinese side is that China is very ready to show itself as a globally responsible actor. It has done its homework and is coming very well prepared for this meeting, and it recognizes that in some ways President Obama in the United States is a bit in a box because first the Congress has to speak and then the U.S. can speak. So I think the interesting observations just from the summit yesterday, number one was that very strong language about the fact that a transition to a green and low-carbon economy is essential and that clean energy industry is going to provide vast opportunities for citizens of both countries in the years ahead. That's a very strong signal, I think, about the future is low carbon, and both leaders in both countries see the opportunities that exist in this low carbon future. Whole range of technology cooperation initiatives announced, from vehicles to CCS to renewables to energy centers, et cetera. So a real plethora of initiatives there coming forward, which I think is good. And on the negotiation side, I think statements of intent of the importance of it, statements of transparency, but not maybe as far as each side would have wanted to go, but statements that they're both ready to go to Copenhagen with targets and actions. So I think that my hope is that that will reinvigorate some of the downward spiral that's been happening in the last week, because I think that it was clearly a key issue for both leaders. So hopefully that gives you a snapshot of where we are now.
I want a lot of applause for this woman right now because, well, this was very helpful, I think, for a lot of us. I mean, you set, here, I'll take that one. Set the groundwork for the rest of this panel and the next panel, because I really want to make sure we're all on a level playing field, knowing who's doing what on climate right now. Taiya, do you want to speak from your seat or from the podium?
Either way.
Wherever you're most comfy.
All
Feng
right.
shui okay there? Okay.
Do you have to turn this on?
No, it's on all the time.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks, Jennifer, for inviting me here. I want to talk a little bit about what China is actually doing and the impact that this has on the climate change negotiations overall. I just came from the Hill, where the Energy Committee, the Senate Energy Committee, was having a hearing this morning with a bunch of us up there, and almost every single question had to do with China. And as I was the one working on China, I got plenty of talking to do.
And we're making you talk more now. I'm so sorry.
It was very interesting because for the U.S., China is kind of hits on every single box of what we consider. So they were talking about, certainly from trade side, some questions about was a cap and trade system going to end up just benefiting China and the U.S. getting left out, or the U.S. purchasing lots of offsets from China and the cost of energy just continuing to rise in the U.S., and jobs, of course, which is what the U.S. cares about. What I find fascinating is that the U.S. and China actually care about many of exactly the same things. And when you talk to the Chinese officials about climate change, jobs are right at the top of their mind as well. And continuing economic growth. How do they maintain economic growth while dealing with climate change? So on a couple of things that are really of great importance for the domestic side of China, on August 12th, Chinese Premier Wen Jiabao announced that China, the State Council, decided that they would now incorporate climate change into both the economic and social planning. This is important because it means that climate change will now be filtered through all of the different aspects of the planning process and also the evaluation process for the officials who are receiving their yearly evaluations on how good of a job they're doing. This was followed by an announcement from the General Assembly that they're going to reinforce and are looking for a low-carbon economic growth plan going forward. Hu Jintao then made the announcements in September at the UN General Assembly of what China's targets are. So this was sort of the first real formal announcement to the world of what China's doing on climate change. This was really paved through by the announcements that Wen had made and that the Assembly made. And what's important about it is that this is what China would really consider itself to be held to. So when you go and talk about actions in the climate change negotiations, these are the things that China is thinking about. And they're making great progress. So let's just say a few to highlight. The reduction of energy intensity by 20% between 2005 and 2010. Well, we look at that and we see that China has has already reduced its carbon intensity by 10%, according to their calculations. Analysts predict that they can continue, and actually by 2010 that they really can make this 20% energy intensity reduction. The next one is looking at 15% of the nation's energy supply from non-fossil fuels by 2020. So China already has the largest surface area of solar water heating in the world, has the 4th largest installed wind capacity, and the most nuclear power capacity under construction in the world. Once again, the expectations are, when you talk to people about it, that they'll be able to reach their goal of 15% by 2020. And actually, there's also another goal, which is 20% renewable power by 2020, that people feel they're fairly well on track for. And I will take a moment and just note that when we talk about installed wind capacity and solar, it doesn't necessarily mean that these things are connected to the grid yet. And this is one of the areas that everybody sort of says, yes, China's the 4th largest wind capacity in the world, but it's not actually doing anything. They're just windmills going around. And that's the key piece, because if China is able to connect these to the grid, then wow, that's an awful lot of capacity coming from renewables. If they are not able to get connected to the grid, then there's room for plenty of criticism about how viable reaching these targets really is. Another really important one is on forest coverage. So the State Forestry Administration has done really phenomenal work in reforesting China. And they're going to continue that. They want to increase their coverage by another 20% from 2005 levels. And the State Forestry Administration says that they're on their way. So if you ever have driven from the Beijing airport into the town of Beijing, you will see as you drive by all of these trees. And they're very tall trees that are about this thick, and they look like they're going to get blown over, and some of them actually have fallen over and have been propped back up. But that is all part of the process. That's what you do. You plant trees. Now, the criticism there would be coming from conservationists who are saying they're planting the same kinds of trees all over China. And I certainly note that there's just an announcement that they're planting trees in the desert in Inner Mongolia, which one will question, is that really going to be the best use of water, or is that really just to meet a target? So that brings us to, I think, really the big question that many people around the world have, which is how can we trust that China is going to be doing what it says it's doing? So if you plant a lot of trees, meet your target by 2010, and then the trees die, or you end up using a lot more water, that doesn't necessarily qualify for having truly increased the capacity. My judgment on this is that China has so many issues going on domestically that it is very much inclined to do everything that it can to fulfill its own promises. Looking at this carbon intensity goal, first, if they meet the goal, what that means is that China will have reduced its carbon emissions by 1.5 billion tons. That's more than all of the countries who ratified the Kyoto Protocol together said that they were going to reduce it from. Again, the negatives say, well, it's just deferred emissions, or that just they're reducing it from business as normal. But what we're looking at is if China were to have done none of these things, they would have produced that much more carbon emissions into the world. So why are they doing it? Why are they taking so much of an effort, and why are they trying to figure out how to have a new type of growth? First of all, as many of you know, stability in China is critically important. So after years and years of civil war and strife and difficulties, China is now a very peaceful country. And for 30 years, they've been that way. Most Chinese over the age of 50, however, still remember what it was like. So when you talk to your friends who live in China, and you say, well, do you want to be a leader in the world? Many of your younger friends will say, yes, we want to be a leader in the world. And we think that we need to be shown a lot of respect. Many of the older Chinese say, no, we want to have a harmonious relationship with the world. And so this is an area that climate change comes in that's very important. For those who remember what it was like before this current area of economic prosperity, they're often wanting to see what they can do to have a harmonious relationship both within China and with the rest of the world. Since 1978, China has achieved nearly double-digit GDP growth. Getting all tangled up here. That means more than 300 million Chinese have been brought out of poverty. Much of their current stability rests on this promise of economic growth, that it will continue and that all citizens will be able to prosper. I like to think of this as the Chinese dream. So you take the American dream, that we all can work hard and become wealthy, you put that on steroids, and then you have the Chinese dream. But this miraculous growth that really was achieved the first round of poverty alleviation has become harder and harder to achieve as China moves up the industrialization scale and deals with its legacy of growth before. So right now, you have difficulties in China with the rivers, this astounding stat that 60% of the rivers cannot support fish life. You have issues of environmental contamination, polluted air, and things that are affecting people on a daily basis. What that means is that the people in many of these cities and towns around China are the ones that are suffering, and they're telling the government about it. There are around approximately 25 protests a day throughout China on environmental issues alone. At the same time, Beijing has been studying climate change and the effects that it will have on China. We have to remember China is part of the world that is hardest hit by climate change. So I was actually noting here, I would think that China would actually be a little higher up because it knows what's going to happen to it on climate change, closer to that 2 degrees than where it was in your chart. It's going to be managing rising sea levels, dealing with increasingly intense storms, and desertification all at once. It's trying to build its electric grid, and they have a lot of difficulties when you keep having storms. So if you remember, they had some very severe winter storms 2 years ago that really brought home this reality of dependence on foreign oil and coal supplies for energy production. They were not able to get coal into the country. They were not able to fire up the coal-fired power plants. In addition to trying to repair the grid, it led to a lot of difficulties and many people without power in very difficult situations for more than a week or so. I was actually caught in that storm. We were at an airport and they shipped us off to another hotel where we stayed for a little while until things could get back on track. It was really, really difficult for the Chinese government to deal with. So they've been coming to this conclusion gradually that relying on foreign oil and foreign coal has some difficulties. So they need to find a way to get off of that. If you know how often China is criticized for dealing with Iran, for dealing with Sudan, you'll have a sense of some of the political challenges that it also are facing as they're trying to secure oil. One of the key things that we hear a lot from Chinese officials is that they feel that the Western world, the industrialized world, has already tied up all the easy supplies of oil. So we get our oil from Saudi Arabia, we get our oil from the Middle East. All of the places where the people are nice and easy to deal with, we've already tied up. And that's why they've had to go into the much more difficult places to be able to extract oil. So the result of all of these different factors has that the Chinese government has really concluded it has to deal with climate change, in addition to energy security and environmental degradation, in order to maintain its economic growth and thereby its national stability. In addition, a lot of the top Chinese officials have come to the conclusion that there's simply not enough resources in the world to support another billion people living the lifestyle that we do in the West or that others around the world have been able to achieve. So what that means, if you're planning on bringing the rest of your billion people up to a high level, a high standard of living, you need to make sure that there are the resources to support that type of living. So they are actively seeking for a new model of sustainable economic growth. And luckily for the world, that coincides perfectly with what we're trying to do for climate change. It coincides certainly with what the U.S. wants to do on energy security for us, and also our own ability to deal with the environment. And what it means is there's great opportunities for all of us. Focusing for a moment on the MRV side, the Chinese government has had a great challenge in dealing with how do you make sure that all of your laws and rules and policies are carried out throughout China. So many of you have heard the statement, the mountains are high and Beijing is far away, as an explanation for why coal-fired power plant scrubbers might be turned off on a regular basis. What a lot of that has to do is the fact that China is a developing country. And when you're a developing country, you are trying to learn how to install procedures that ensure that all of the different parts of your country follow your national law. The U.S. went through exactly this same experience. EPA, which is right next door to here, has 20 years of history working with China and helping support the Chinese in all of the work that they're doing in developing their own MEP, the Ministry of Environmental Protection. They've done some great work, as has DOE and many other U.S. agencies, and many of the NGOs, nonprofits, and think tanks who've been working in China for a long time. So we need to ensure that all of these organizations are able to continue that work of helping China to develop its own monitoring and evaluation system. WRI has done great work on this, kind of tracking what happens in China, how the the NDRC and the National Statistics Bureau work together and separately in order to track and make sure that their carbon intensity numbers are fairly viable. You run into some difficulties because the Chinese are always struggling to exactly figure out where their economic growth figures are. So as we look forward about China committing to an energy intensity goal, we want to understand that you can have perfect statistics on energy intensity coming out, but if you don't have the same perfect statistics on economic growth, it'll be very difficult to evaluate that. And the criticisms that you often get from China is that, or of the Chinese system for evaluating economic growth, is that the process comes through provincial governments, nobody quite knows, and then the national government is faced with the challenge of trying to estimate the growth throughout the whole country because their information coming out of the provinces is not so clear. To get around some of those difficulties now on energy intensity, they report directly, companies report directly to the National Statistics Bureau, so that it doesn't have to go through a middleman in the process. But let's talk really quickly. So we have stories of power plants sitting idle without their scrubbers on. We have stories of power plants that have been turned off being turned back on. But there's some really great positive stories that are coming out too. Two of the most notable programs aimed at reducing carbon intensity are the program of large substituting for small, which makes perfect sense in terms of it is large power plants, newly formed power plants, best technology in the world power plants, are being built to take over and pick up the work that some small, very dirty power plants have been doing. Through this program, China has shut down 54 gigawatts worth of small inefficient power plants, coal-fired power plants, and plans to close another 31 gigawatts worth in the next 3 years. This is a pretty impressive endeavor. At the same time, the other program that we talk about a lot is the Top 1,000 Energy Consuming Enterprises program. And this one began in 2006, and in that year alone, the program accounted for 2/3 of China's efficiency improvements. And if that current trend continues, by 2010, they could prevent as much as 450 million tons of carbon dioxide from being released into the atmosphere. Which, if you think about that just in relative terms, they're not looking at all of how difficult it is to prevent that being released. 450 tons is almost 100 tons more than the EU has been working on trying to meet its own Kyoto targets. So it's a good chunk of carbon that they've been able to keep out of the environment. A couple of things that have come out as we've talked to people in China. They've got their system for doing MRV. They are not interested in international inspectors being in China. This is one of the questions we get often is, well, shouldn't we just send some people over there to help the Chinese do their work and report back and we'll all feel more comfortable? We turn that around and say, how would Americans feel about international inspectors coming in and checking up on our work? The Chinese will care a lot about reciprocity. We're the Americans and the Europeans and all the other industrialized countries to say, yes, we would like to have international inspectors come and check up on us. Then China would probably see this in a different light. But for right now, they're very uncomfortable with it. And China, at the same time, is quite sensitive to international reputational issues. So one of the ways that everyone's been trying to come up with a new version of how do we know what's going on in China and developing countries is to create an international body that would allow for countries to monitor each other, similar to the way that the WTO works now. So every time that the new round of data would come out, you check it out, you take a look at it, and say, well, I've got some questions on this. The U.S. could challenge China. China could challenge the U.S. We could all challenge the EU. We could challenge France. That would be fun. But the idea is that you really work together and look at how each other's trade flows are going. The flows is the same idea of trade, but the flows of carbon emissions, and see, does it add up in an effective way? Tech transfer is an issue that the Chinese are often likely to bring up. There was a decision made some years ago through the State Council that China was going to work very hard on having technology transferred. That is part of the discussion. You saw that it's part of the piece that China's been really pushing forward on. Interesting data coming out on that, which is just fun to take a look at. McKinsey's been doing a study on wind turbines. There is one piece of technology that China does not still have. GE, for example, creates wind turbines, sends pieces to China, they put them into the windmills, they send them back to us, as you've heard about the project going on in Texas right now. It's actually been determined that if GE and the German and other companies were to, I think it's a Danish company, Vestas, were to give that technology to China, it would only reduce the costs by about 1 to 2%. What would really help China a lot in wind capacity is getting their windmills hooked up to the grid. It seems fairly simple, but it's a challenge. And when we all get ourselves caught up in technology transfer, I think it's very important to step back and take a look at what technology really would need to be transferred and what's the economic consequence of that. In solar, we have a similar determination. That China actually has access to most of the solar. It's the photovoltaic piece that is still outstanding, but if you were to give that to the Chinese, it would only reduce the cost from 1 to 5%. In this case, what they're saying is that it would be a whole lot cheaper if we could all push for the next generation of solar panels to be developed. Then we're going to be able to really realize the cost savings, because the current generation is just costly to create, and we need to get to the next generation of solar. I think just I want to close by talking quickly about the targets that were announced that the U.S. and China would be announcing at Copenhagen. China has really done a remarkable job in the last year. A year ago, very few people knew what was going on in China. Now we wake up in the morning and see Tom Friedman has yet again written an article about how the U.S. is going to be left behind China.
They're eating our lunch.
That's right, eating our lunch. Now, I'm happy about that, because when I first started working on China, they were talking about China eating our lunch through economic issues and taking over through trade, which I guess this is a type of trade, but it's a slightly different way. This is saying that China is more advanced than us. And that's a wonderful thing to hear, because that means that the message is getting out. All the statistics that I've told you are things that you've probably already heard before. The concern is that if China goes to Copenhagen and does not sort of familiarize the world with where its energy intensity target might come out, and goes ahead and just announces one, it could be met with a lot of opposition. So, for example, China were to go and announce a 45% energy intensity reduction from 2005 levels, which is what the IEA had suggested. So it makes sense that the Chinese would probably look that as the high end of what they're considering. They're going to get a lot of pushback, because that's a number that's been out there. People have talked about it. They've discussed it. That is if they announce it directly without saying, hey, this is what we're probably going to do. And the reason I want to point to this is because China has a history of doing exactly that. They do all the research, an amazing sort of looking around the world of what's going on, figuring it out, testing it out in China, and then go ahead and launch it on the international community. In this case, we can't be looking at that happening. The international community is expecting a number more like 60%. That's very ambitious and probably out of the range of what many Chinese think they can do. So what we are going to be doing now is encouraging Chinese to talk about what they're thinking a little bit ahead of time, so that people can get accustomed to it, can get used to the idea, and then when it is finally announced, it's not a surprise. The U.S. government's doing that now. We're going through a very painful process we call the U.S. legislative system. We all know exactly what they're thinking, and we hear about it every day. What that means is that when we get to Copenhagen and make our announcement of the target, nobody's going to be surprised as to what the U.S. is doing. And in international negotiations, surprise is rarely helpful. And so I'll leave it there. Look forward to your questions.
Okay. Again, applause for this person. And now we get to mix it up a bit. We get to see a film. But so why don't you come and, do you want to do your clicking?
Yeah, we'll get started, and then I'll talk for just a minute.
Sure.
I'm probably the least experienced China expert, so I'll talk.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Shortest amount of time.
Do you want to have a hand up?
Yeah. I don't have volume, though.
I need SAV for volume. Whoops.
Human beings are.
Okay. Okay. We got it.
The human beings actually faces in its history many times of great challenges. Global climate challenge is indeed unprecedented.
Over the last couple of years, there's been a real sea change in China, where they're discussing climate and climate change connected with this energy and energy efficiency movement.
那么具体的数目，这个没有统计，这个我现在说不上来。是否我可以去了解一下，再来告诉你。
a major driving forces behind the Chinese government consideration. I think both for domestic consideration and also to be shown as a responsible nation to deal with global climate change issues as well.
It will help with their global climate change strategy, but this is also part of China's energy security strategy. It will help reduce local air pollution, which is still a very serious problem here and something that the Chinese government is really still trying to address more effectively.
This is a time where we face the difficulty right now, the great challenges, but this is also the time when the great optimism and the idealism is very much needed.
So I don't need to do the plug for Climate Works. So let's see. So this footage was shot just a few weeks ago in mostly northeastern China, in Shandong and Jiangsu province around Beijing and around Shanghai, Wuxi, Yancheng. And but before I get into what you saw and what my experience was there, just a really quick background on the Climate Works Foundation. We're a global network of philanthropic organizations and NGOs focused specifically on supporting policies that improve energy efficiency, promote the use of clean renewable energy, and reduce carbon emissions. We focus on in the sectors where you see most of those emissions globally, which is the building sector, transportation, the power sector, forests, and industry. And we focus specifically in the regions that are responsible for most of those emissions. So the United States, Europe, China, India, and then Brazil and Indonesia, where you need to protect forests. We have a very specific goal, which is consistent with where I think we're trying to get a global framework toward, which is a future of no more than 450 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and a temperature increase average of 2 degrees centigrade. Our focus on the policy specifically is what I want to get into. The China Sustainable Energy Program, you saw a couple of the program officers and the deputy director from the Beijing office in that. They're a key partner of ours in China. They have a memorandum of understanding with the Chinese government to support, to provide technical support on issues related to energy policy. In fact, Madam Chen Li, who is the highest-ranking woman in the Communist Party in China, is on the Climate Works Board of Directors. We have a very deep relationship with the Chinese government and in working with them to try to resolve mostly these technical issues. And so most of what we do is really focused on this technical support on sectoral policy. Within the sort of sectors, I mentioned the power sector is one of the key ones. Obviously in China, that's one of the places where you see a lot of the emissions. I think you mentioned briefly the Top 1,000 program. Industrial emissions, industrial energy use in China is actually responsible for something like 2/3 of all energy use in the country. And so if you touch on the power sector, that's obviously not other industry uses like cement or chemicals, et cetera, but the power sector is responsible for a large chunk of that. And so China's aggressive rules on renewable energy and renewable energy standards, that's a policy you can implement anywhere in the world to deploy clean energy. We've seen it in a lot of states in the United States. Obviously, there's countries all over Europe that have this, and I believe the EC also has a target as well. One thing that you touched on, and we're not, there's a couple other films that I'm not going to show you, so I want to just briefly talk about what they.
But you're going to show the wind one.
We're going
right?
to show the wind one. But we also visited the Suntech facility in Wuxi, China. Some of you may have heard Suntech just announced they're going to build a new manufacturing facility in Phoenix. The Wuxi facility is a 1 gigawatt solar manufacturing factory. For those of you familiar with power, that's a huge amount of solar panels. China right now is producing 35 to 40% of the solar panels sold on Earth, and they're exporting 95% of those. I'm going to leap to another fact that actually came out this week. The bank HSBC did a study that found that the cost of solar has fallen 50% in the last year. Those two facts are very tightly related. China's scaling up of solar manufacturing has driven down the cost dramatically. There's been a couple other factors that have contributed to this. A shortage in polysilicon supply has gone away. There's now a glut of silicon on the market. That's had a dramatic impact on solar pricing. But China's aggressive entry into the solar market in the manufacturing side is lowering cost for installers all over the world. And you can talk to any solar company in California or Germany or Italy or Spain, and they'll tell you that my costs are reduced because I'm able to buy lower cost panels from China. So there's another impact here of trade and of scaling up manufacturing that China is actually assisting the world with just through its scaled manufacturing of solar. And the other thing to keep in mind is they're actually exporting 95% of that product. So they haven't even really tried to deploy this technology domestically much yet. That's something they're working on now. And I think what we're going to see in the wind farm video, that we'll see if they have any kind of success with solar as they've had with wind. This is going to be a massive, massive market for solar power in China over the next several years. So with that, I think I'll show this next wind film, and then I'll talk for a couple more minutes about what I sort of saw, a couple of anecdotes. There's some fascinating things about the kinds of people who are working in these facilities, both on the manufacturing side for wind turbines and manufacturing for solar panels. And I'll get to that after I show this next piece, which is just about 4 minutes. So.
Yeah. And these films are going to be available online pretty soon, I think.
Pretty soon.
Pretty soon. And we'll let you all know.
Yes. Could the lights
have the lights down, please?
Well, when I first came to China about 10 years ago now to look at wind energy development here, there were just a handful of wind turbines in China. And many people in the Chinese government who I spoke with thought I was silly for looking at wind energy development here. They said this was a technology that was reserved for the wealthier countries and not something that China was serious about or was going to be serious about anytime soon. Here we are about 10 years later, and China is looking to be the largest wind power market in the world by the end of this year.
Over the last 4 years, we have been seeing doubling of installation capacity every single year. So, in 2005, China had, I think, a cumulative capacity of just about 1.3 gigawatts. Now, in end of 2008, we're talking about 13 gigawatts. I think people were, fully expecting this year may not be doubling again, but at least by 80 or 90% growth. So we're talking about 20, 25 gigawatts by end of 2009. So that's that's a growth nowhere in the world has experienced previously.
In the wind energy industry, just 5 years ago, there was really only one Chinese wind turbine manufacturer. Today, we see about 80 wind turbine manufacturers in the Chinese marketplace. And the large-scale wind projects and solar projects that we're seeing crop up around China are not just geared at deployment of these technologies. They're actually geared at setting up large industrial bases around these technologies. So, for example, the large wind energy projects that are being built up in northern and western China are accompanied by local manufacturing in those regions.
在我们这里这个一年呢，将有1500兆瓦的容量的机组出产，然后呢，这是相当于是有1000台1.5兆瓦的机组。我们现在这个看到我们机组呢，主要是发往全国各地都有，主要是集中在内蒙和南方沿海地区。然后呢，我们的这个主要客户现在是在国内主要客户就是几大电力公司，华能、华电之类，龙源。
这些企业应该建立这些企业，应该说他们的初期目标现在应该是瞄准江苏这个风电市场。但是，从我对他们的了解来讲啊，国际市场是他们将来去的一个方向，这是肯定的。
我们公司这个分厂的分机主要是吉益公司在国内生产的1.5兆瓦的分机，和南通万阳安旭能公司生产的1.5兆瓦的分机。我认为主要有2点，第一个就是这个我们发的电这个政府是全额收购，而且是优先收购， 就是给一个固定的电价给一个固定的电价，能保持我们这个公司或者企业能有一个一定的盈利水平。
China and the United States share a lot of challenges when it comes to the large-scale development of renewable energy. Both China and the United States have excellent renewable energy resources in parts of the country where we don't have a lot of demand for electricity. Both countries are going to have to look towards really large-scale transmission planning over the coming years if they're going to be able to really take advantage of the renewable resources in these areas. This is an area where I think the U.S. and China have a lot of potential to work together to try to figure out how to expand their grid to make it smarter and to allow them to incorporate much larger shares of renewables in their power mix.
So I'm very, very hopeful that this kind of bilateral and multilateral collaboration between China and the other countries will produce, some substantive progress on clean energy, the environment, and climate change.
It's nice to have the images here. Okay, lights up, please, if we can trouble you in the AV. Thanks. Okay.
So I just want to, from traveling around and visiting the wind turbine factory and the wind farm and the solar factory, there was one thing that sort of struck me. It was about the workers in particular, especially in the solar facility. These were all mostly engineering students, people who were fairly well educated, but at the Wuxi Suntech factory, from looking at them, there was very few people over the age of 30. And I was talking to some of these workers, and I was asking them what was it like to work in the solar industry or work in the wind industry. And I'm going to swerve for a moment, but hopefully you'll follow me. I live in the Bay Area, and there's always some hot tech thing that's happening. And so my social circle includes people who are, 10 years ago it was .com, and 5 years ago it was blogs and social media, and now iPhone apps are the hot thing. Everybody and their brother is developing a new app for the iPhone. I got that same feeling from the solar workers. Every one of them, to a person, said, I asked them, so what's it like to work in the solar industry, and why did you choose this path? And they said, I studied this in college. This is the hot new industry in China. It's an exciting new technology, and I want to be a part of the future. And I said, this could have been one of my friends working on an iPhone app. I mean, obviously a different outcome. But it had the same sort of feeling as people who are just really excited about something that they see as a massive growth opportunity, both for themselves professionally and also just what China's trying to achieve nationally. And I want to put that in context. There's the Chinese government. One of the things that one of the films that I don't show, I spoke with a provincial official in Shandong who is actually the deputy manager of the energy division. And Shandong is China's largest province in terms of GDP. It's responsible for 10% of China's GDP. It's the largest energy consumer in China. And he is personally responsible for overseeing that energy use. So he has no small task. This is where much of China's industry is located, is in Shandong, at least for eastern China. He started out by saying he's personally very concerned about climate change. He's seen the effects of pollution in Shandong. He's grateful that the central government is providing the policy and the support at the provincial level so that he can use his leverage to try to move these industries to reduce pollution. Cement is one in particular where obviously there's a huge amount of pollution that they're addressing. But to a person, they all said, we're concerned about climate change. We have to reduce our energy use. We have to reduce our energy intensity. And we really see renewables as not just a path forward for pollution and climate mitigation, but as their industrial future. It's sort of a little twist on what we're used to talking about over here in terms of green jobs, which sort of sounds like a soft energy path. China's, from what I saw, they see this as a large-scale industrial play, an opportunity for them to create a lot of jobs domestically and tap very large and fast-growing markets overseas for the sale of these products and services. So I guess with that, we'll move on
We
to
will open up.
questions. Yeah.
Now you've had here a rich landscape in looking at where China is in terms of on its path to Copenhagen. I took a slightly different angle than I don't know if Bryce is expecting me to do, but we started with the global snapshot of the actual negotiations down to national policy, clean tech investment to the clean tech worker. It is now your job, and here's a microphone for you. If you wouldn't mind, when you ask the question, to just say your name and affiliation so we know where you're coming from. And, yeah. All right. Ada, this gentleman right here.
Sure. Hello, I'm Yves Tiberghien. I'm in the next panel, actually, from University of British Columbia, the one who will present on Japan. I had a couple questions for Jennifer Morgan on the big picture of things. The first one is if you have any insight on what happened at APEC. And it started with, Japan pitting its very strong new position, similar to Europe, and being sort of surrounded by other leaders who didn't go along and instead went to a softer approach. But who pushed for that softening? Who pushed for the removal of the 50% target? Was it China? Was it the US only? If you know anything, that'd be great. And the second thing is, at the same time, there was this Lula-Sarkozy meeting. We talked of bashing France, but here, this very unusual axis between Brazil and the European component, talking of spreading and targeting the G2 particularly as their enemy, or not letting the US and China calling all the shots, trying to open up this G77 group. But if you know anything about this, if it's significant.
Sure. On the latter, I find that having lived in the European Union for 7 years in Germany, it was always, okay, what's Sarkozy up to now? Because Merkel is a very deliberate kind of person. But I think this French-Brazilian initiative has been in the works for a while. And I think in some ways it stems from two places. One is kind of next tier of countries wanting to have a say. But France has a huge interest in forests, mostly because of its connection with the Congo. And their experience with the Congo and the Congo Basin countries, and I think they've transferred some of that into the, working that experience with Brazil as well, and sees forests as an incredibly important part of the solution and an important part of the agreement. How that's going to play out in this mega world, I think is still up for grabs. I mean, I welcome certainly. I think it's remarkable, actually, if you look at the number of heads of state initiatives that are coming forward on climate change right now from developed and developing countries or together. So I would see it as another kind of attempt to make sure that Copenhagen is ambitious, and that there is this worry, which I didn't really talk about, which is that the bilateral between the U.S. and China ends up in the lowest common denominator, of course. That on the measure reportable and verifiable, you can't get an agreement for something that is robust, so you go to the lowest common denominator of pledge and review. And I think that's a big worry by certainly the European Union. I think Lula, I'm not sure. Brazil has actually not been all of that ambitious on this piece either, so it's kind of interesting on that side of things. In the context of APEC, I had heard for weeks now that it wasn't looking good on the text, and that the 2 degrees had been in and was taken back out, that the chair wasn't very ambitious. But I think what the striking part about the APEC summit was the fly-in of the Danish Prime Minister to convene kind of an emergency session around Copenhagen with the heads of state. And in a way, to have these statements coming out afterwards, which I personally think the popular media has missed the story on this one. I think that it was a story that said these leaders are all really serious about this problem. They want to come to an agreement and see how far they can get in Copenhagen, but they see that they can't get quite everything done yet, and therefore they may need a little bit more time. And that's really quite a positive story rather than this negative, we're spiraling into the abyss because Copenhagen's not going to deliver the final treaty that we all knew was never going to be delivered anyway. So those are just two observations to your questions.
Okay. The bar said hi. That was a good first questions. Next one out here. I know I've got curious people. Oh, right there. There, Helen.
I'm Helen Rafael, Resources for the Future. Council. I have 3 questions, quick. First, I have heard, I appreciate the fact that China, and having seen it myself, is planting so many trees all over. But I have heard that because they need so much wood for construction that's going on at such a rapid pace, they're importing a huge amount from Indonesia, and that the Indonesian forests are being depleted, partly because of exporting trees. And I wonder what you know about that. It's presumably, I've lived in Indonesia too, very hard to verify what's going on in the jungles all over Indonesia. The second question is, I realize that the wind farms are obviously the wind blows primarily in the north and west, and the main need for the energy is in the east. And you have this long transmission line problem. What are the major impediments, since it's, well, let me leave the question at that. And the third question is, it perhaps is a scientific question that I should postpone to the second, to Mr. Yang in the second session. I've heard that there's a push for, since so much coal is used in China and the United States also for electricity production, that there's a push for just scientific cooperation on carbon capture and storage between Chinese scientists and American scientists. And I've listened to the most advanced American science discussion of carbon capture and storage, which is in no way practical yet. And I'm wondering what the scientific abilities are for cooperation between the advanced science on CCS and Chinese scientists. Is that really something that would be worthwhile, or is it most a question of technology transfer from us where we don't even have the technology yet?
Yeah. Okay, good, rich questions. I think everyone will be able to jump in on somewhere. Do you want to start off with the timber one? Because, I mean, there's that, what's happening within China, but also kind of, you know, where is that in Copenhagen when they're talking, because you mentioned, Jennifer, that forests would be a part of it, and China as the major timber importer and then exporter.
Right.
So I leave it to you to duke it out.
Sure, I can start on the China side. China actually has been quite focused on this. The U.S. and China signed an MOU dealing with forestry issues, especially in China, in 2007. And from that, and as part of that, the next stage is a sort of bilateral cooperation on that. We've brought in the EU, and the Chinese have actually launched through the APEC, an East Asian kind of regional group that's working on how do you set up a process by which wood can be determined if it's legally harvested or not. So Indonesia, being very aware, is interested in sustainable forestry, but they're also having some challenges in terms of making sure that the wood is not harvested illegally, and need to have a process too. So really what we're discovering is that the issue is not just, you can't blame China for this one alone, you can't blame Indonesia, and you definitely need to make sure you blame all of us sitting in this room if you've ever bought anything from IKEA or any of the other companies that are selling wood products to us. So what we're trying to do is put together throughout the supply chain a process by which you can verify, was the wood legally harvested, working with countries to make sure that there's a sustainable harvestation of it, and then working with consumers to educate consumers, spending a lot of time working with companies that are purchasing these things. So I know IKEA, Crate and Barrel, others are now launching their own sustainable harvesting process. And that's what we need to be looking for. Just if you want to do your part, that's what you have to look for when you go to purchase some new furniture. Make sure that it was sustainably harvested, and it goes all. So it's a giant issue. It is very, very difficult to work. Just a quick insight into how the Chinese process works. They have 3 different agencies that work on these issues, some looking for legality, some looking for just making sure that they aren't bringing diseases into China. And as they go through the process, they weren't talking all together. So the guys that actually open up the wood and take a look at it for diseases weren't the ones who were also looking for the legal documentation. So the Chinese are trying to find ways to streamline their own process to have a better sense of what comes into the country, and at the same time pressing the US and Europe to be much more aware of what wood we're importing from them, so that we really look at the full responsibility there.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just, in the context of Copenhagen, I think that the forestry issue on the table there are a set of policies and measures or goals or targets that the major tropical forest countries could take to reduce emissions from deforestation and degradation, and how you put in place a program to get them ready to be able to do that. So clearly there are leakage issues that are potential, and how they put those boundaries around that and try and limit the leakage in between the timber markets, I think, is a huge challenge in that context. I'll take a quick comment on your question on carbon capture and storage. Worked for many years in the European context on this, on an EU-China initiative to try and get a demonstration plant built, which Europe, through the UK presidency, started in 2005. And has gone through actually an initial feasibility study on that, and is now in its second phase, which is getting ready to actually build something. And the key challenge there has actually been getting Europe to provide the financing for particularly the storage. China was ready to do a lot of the IGCC piece, but getting the financing, we had it all, it was all ready to go, and in the heads of state meeting at the last minute, a couple of member states blocked about 400 or 500 million euros going into a demonstration plant there as one of a series that Europe is doing in Europe, 10 to 12 demos. Yesterday, the U.S.-China partnership actually announced that there will be a whole initiative around 21st century coal, including scientific exchange. So, I mean, but to get to your question, I think that everything is needed, actually. I think that in the context of the scientific questions around storage particularly, and the implications of storage, we do quite a lot around stakeholder involvement in CCS. We've done something in the United States, and globally we're now actually working on that in China, because stakeholder engagement is absolutely essential on that. And then there's the technology transfer and how you do joint ventures around it, how you actually get it built, who shares the costs, what's the knowledge sharing around that. So a big piece there. And it was interesting for me to look at the focus of, the recently announced one is there is a feasibility study there for an IGCC plant, but also engagement of Peabody Energy and the GreenGen, the Chinese version of their own CCS demonstration plant, as well as GE and AES working with Chinese companies on various levels of this. So this is one I think we need to throw everything we've got at, because either it's going to be a big part of the solution, or we need to find out very quickly that it's not. And if it's not, then we have a whole other range of issues, because we take out a big wedge of how to take carbon out of the atmosphere.
I think, Matt?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that on CCS, one thing, Jennifer, you talked about is the UK is a really important country on this. They're the first European country to formally ban coal plants that don't have carbon capture and sequestration I think it's either ready or actually installed. So I think that you need to also get countries engaged. Do I have that wrong?
Yeah, they've said no new coal-fired power plants without
carbon capture and storage. That's right.
Yep.
We're not likely to build many new coal plants in the U.S. I certainly hope we don't build many new coal plants in the U.S. China's going to be building a lot of new coal. And so I think there's just the reality on the ground is it makes the most sense to try to do a demonstration and deployment in China, where you're going to see a lot of the world's new coal capacity built over the next 20 to 30 years. So there's just the issue of who actually needs the technology the most. Obviously, the world needs it everywhere, but if you can't come up with a solution, as Jennifer was saying, we need to pivot pretty quickly. So
yeah, because China, despite all the policies that Taiya talked about with the renewable energy, which is great. They're meeting these targets. Their coal consumption is still just exploding, and remember it doubled in 7 years instead of 10, and so it's going to keep going up. So this is really the only way that a lot of the people in China see that they can
Actually,
can't
that's
limit it.
not even the case because
not
they
even
don't
the
like
case?
CCS.
Oh, they don't like CCS. Oh,
so
I stand, but they just signed
this
it.
21st century coal thing was hopefully going to be a CCS thing. And as you see, only one piece of it is CCS. And they're looking at is the technology. They're not interested in CCS because it's so expensive, and we haven't been able to come up with the proofing of the. And they need to know where they're going to put all of the carbon.
Yeah.
I think that they're
taken out of it.
interested, but they're skeptical.
So
because they've shifted
there.
significantly since 2005, where they didn't want anything to do with any initiatives what the UK wanted them to do. So now they just did this mega, conference a couple of weeks ago, which was clear that they're very interested in exploring it, but they're certainly not ready to pay the extra energy penalty costs or the extra costs for the demos. So, and they're not. I don't think they're where the UK or the US would like them to be on this type of stuff. So
no, they're not there yet. The interesting thing about this project is we've got Peabody. You've also got Duke Energy involved in Green Gen as well.
Yeah.
So there have been multiple groups who are working on the same one and are exchanging scientists. And this is a wonderful example of how the U.S. and China working together can hopefully move us to the next stage. Because we don't have a technology, there's not something to protect necessarily. And hopefully we can, by working together and having a test plant, this is the first one, really it's the furthest along in the world, that we can really make some breakthroughs.
Okay, and we had one last lingering question about, and I think maybe start off with you, Matt. I know on the wind farms and the fact that a lot of the wind farms are located in Inner Mongolia, but how do you get that power to the coast? Did you?
Yeah, this is a problem that we face in identical measure in the United States. You have to build a lot of transmission. You need to make your grid have some kind of intelligence to know when the electrons are needed, where they're needed, and what's happening with the wind and sun when that demand is arising. Right now, in the U.S., for the most part, we have a stupid grid. Utilities cannot tell you where customer demand is spiking and when and why and how to adjust for it and use renewables more efficiently in those demand scenarios. China's got the same problems. So, the large dollar solution is you have to build a lot of transmission, but you still need to work out the integration issues, the grid sort of capacity issues. So there's, as you saw in the agreement that Hu and President Obama signed, that's one of the things they want to look at is how to work out these issues of integrating renewables to the grid. It's almost literally the identical situation. You go to the western United States, it's where all the sun and wind is. People live on the coasts. China, all the people are on the coast on the east, all the wind and sun's out west. So it's a perfect area for collaboration and cooperation.
But I have heard, though, and that can be confirmed because these people know more than me in this, but we did do a research brief on smart grid and saw that, the Chinese are building what they call strong grid. They're not as concerned about the smart just yet, right? I mean, because smart will come. I mean, because they want to get this power there, and I've talked to a number, people in the energy sector in the U.S., and they said that the Chinese technology for transmission is better than ours.
How about smart strength?
Smart strength. That's what they're working towards. Sounds like an aerobic class, doesn't it?
But Jennifer, that goes to the same thing that we know that the Chinese have a cleaner coal fleet than we do.
Yeah.
Their electrical grid is hopefully stronger and smarter than ours as they create it, and that's an advantage that they have of being in China and not having to retrofit and redo it for the second time around.
Okay, some other we've another question right here on the edge. Oh, please speak in the mic because we are webcast, so we can let them hear you.
My name is Qijun Yang. I'm from Duke University. Actually, I'm on the second panel. I have comment about the transmission issue in the United States and China. They are both problems, but actually the problem in the United States is much worse than in China. In the United States, one of the major barriers is siting. If you want to site a transmission line, typically it takes 8 to 10 years. In China, it typically takes about 1 to 3 months.
Fair enough.
It's true.
That's true.
Yeah, things do go fast. I mean, that's why when we had Duke Energy here a few weeks ago, I mean, they were just, I asked them, why is Duke Energy in China, right? Because it's not front page news here, but that they said, yeah, the Chinese are doing things fast. The IGCC, I mean, it's bigger, and that they feel they can learn things. And you've got Google and Cisco there. So, I mean, in terms of learning fast and quick about what's working, the standards that would be set for this, and then bringing it back here, in theory. Yes? Some other questions or comments? Let's go over here in the front, and then you go to the back, Natalie, with him next. Thank you.
Hi, Rob Weiss, World Resources Institute, or work for you. My question is, obviously there's been a lot of good news coming out of Beijing recently with the various project-based kind of cooperation things we've seen today. But isn't that kind of the easy stuff? Isn't it kind of easy just to say we're going to give $75 million apiece to a joint research center? It seems to me that one of the bigger issues, I guess, is that depending on which economic sectors China chooses to pursue, whether China moves towards more domestic consumption-based, moves away from exports, moves towards services rather than industries, that really affects their emissions trajectory more than some of these other variables we're looking at. Are these issues being talked about in a climate setting? And maybe this is more directed to Taiya. I don't know if you have more expertise on this, but are we engaging with China on these issues of economic rebalancing in the context of climate change and in the context of reducing emissions?
There was a great conversation that a group of us had with Wang Shishan once. We were talking about you need to increase your consumption and explaining all of the economic reasons that China needs to increase its consumption and the U.S. needs to do more on the saving side. And the Vice Premier said, well, should we really be increasing our consumption? Don't we have to deal with climate change? And it just set me thinking, wow. Yeah, he's right, actually. The world doesn't benefit from Chinese people consuming more. So it does benefit from working with the Chinese to find a new model of economic growth. We know that one part of that is the technology piece. Certainly there are trade components to it. There's overall economic management pieces to it as well. So yes, on some level, pragmatic cooperation is easy until, of course, you involve politics in it, and then it's very hard. And part of the goal between having a clean energy track for U.S.-China cooperation is to really let our scientists get together and get our scientists talking to each other, get our business people working together and talking to each other, because they are really good at finding solutions. Whereas politicians tend to come up with WTO requirements and other things that slow down progress. And so, yes, you're right, that's the easy stuff, but that's also the place where we can make the most gains the most quickly. And hopefully the idea is that as we press forward on a pragmatic cooperation train, we'll move on the climate change negotiations train. We will continue encouraging and strengthening bilateral cooperation. And that somewhere in there, we're going to find what this new model of economic growth looks like. And it's not going to be one that looks like the U.S. It's not going to be one that looks like China right now. China will evolve its own economic path that's going to be different than the one that the U.S. finds, because there is something uniquely Chinese about theirs. I think we'll learn an awful lot from them. And what we're finding now is that by working together, with the two countries together, working on kind of creating a single standard market, because we haven't talked here at all about standards, but if you want to really push your innovation forward and getting the private sector to put all of its resources into this, they want targets, they want a price on carbon, and they want to know that they've got the U.S. market and the Chinese market to sell to. So if we have a single standard between the U.S. and China, that's probably the biggest motivator that we can possibly have to get the new technology put together, and from there to develop this new model of economic growth.
Go ahead, John.
I'll go after you. Go ahead.
So there's a couple of things I'll add to that. One is that a lot of action is in sectoral policy. A global treaty gets you sort of the leftovers that you can't finance out of self-interest. So the energy efficiency measures that China's taking, those are in their self-interest. It's reducing their oil imports, it's reducing their reliance on coal, it's reducing local air pollution. They're doing those things because those are smart things to do. And by the way, they save you a lot of money. So I think that there's, what we refer to in McKinsey speak, for those of us who've worked too much with those, the left half of the cost curve. China's attacking everything on that side of the curve. Every country should attack everything on that side of the curve. It's the lunch you get paid to eat. It's the energy you're wasting in your economy. So I think we're seeing that at the national policy level, China gets that on a fundamental level, and they're doing everything they can to address it. There's another piece, though, that's really a sort of a cause for hope over the long term, which is the sort of economic transformation you were mentioning in your question. China right now is in the process, I'm going to flub the stat a little bit, but they're building a USA worth of roads and bridges and buildings and schools and infrastructure in the next 10 to 12 years. infrastructure for 300 million people. But think about what happens when that's over. So one of the things that you hear about is China's using 50% of the world's cement right now. Well, cement is accountable for 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. What happens when China's no longer building all those bridges and roads and buildings? Well, their cement manufacturing is going to go off a cliff, for one thing. You don't build infrastructure forever. In some cases, maybe you tear down stuff because you didn't do it right, and you have to do it again. But the point is that there's a moment in the foreseeable future when China will be fundamentally done building this infrastructure and will shift to the kind of economy you're talking about, which is services and value-added products and that sort of thing. One of the comments I've heard actually from the clean tech industry is they've been shocked by how quickly China moved into value-added products. And they're completely sort of, especially the solar manufacturing industry. They had no idea China was going to be able to make panels that worked as efficient as theirs for half the cost. I mean, the cost of solar panels have fallen 50% in 1 year. And that's not entirely China's doing, but it's a fair amount of it. So those two things together, there's a lot you can do in the sectors. And then keep in mind that this infrastructure push they're making, which has a huge carbon load associated with it, is not a permanent state. So.
I guess my question would be, optimally, you would be trying to intervene in that time frame.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So that they don't follow the carbon-intensive pathway that we have. And, I mean, you're right, in a way. It is the easy stuff. And I look at the U.S.-China piece, and I think it's an incredibly important foundation, because I think it's these two presidents building a way forward. I wish they'd worked a bit more with, frankly, the European Union, who's been doing this for 10 years and has a demo up and that's supposed to be built by 2020. It actually had a target. Well, if the three of them had gotten together, then maybe they could have made it happen, right? This is a feasibility study for something that might happen someday. There's not even a build date here, right? So for me, there's the foundational stuff that needs to happen. And I think that's all about the exchanges, and it's incredibly important. But the piece that I hope that this can then create the foundation for is, what are the transformational outcomes? Where's the free trade agreement in low carbon goods and services, right? And where's the CCS in the cement, right? I mean, we do a lot on the cement sector in China through our greenhouse gas protocol, and there, the great things that are going on there. But we know if we want to get the transformational change to stay below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, then how do we build on the foundation, but then get the transformational piece? And I think that's kind of the core of your question. And how do you have the trust to do it? I mean, partly it's pragmatism, and then you work on the pragmatism and you get there. But if you don't have that vision, then sometimes the pragmatism will stay incremental and it won't take it to that next step. So I think this is a space to watch.
And I want to, and I think what you just said about trust is vitally important. I mean, when you look at the NGOs like WRI, NRDC, and also the Energy Foundation, who've been in China for a long time and have been working on a lot of, Energy Foundation, I bow down to them, because, they've done amazing things in terms of working with the Chinese, in terms of helping to, shape policy, but empower and build capacity. And I often have said, that the U.S. government really needs to look to our U.S. NGO community a bit more for the kind of the guanxi, some of the connections to, some of that, maybe that good trust can rub off on them. But I think that it's not impossible, and but this is a good start, right?
Right. Oh yeah, no, definitely.
I'm the eternal optimist here, but
very important.
I had a question in the back. I think Natalie can. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Haoming Huang from China Association for NGO Cooperation. I'm so appreciated to have this kind of opportunity to learning three panel, very good presentation in terms of the China, the green revolution issues. So I also would like to get your ideas about the carbon taxi issues in China, which regard to the carbon taxi is a very hot topic in the China, because in our organization we also host the Chinese NGO network for the climate changes. So we also have the debate. Some people support the carbon taxi. Some people say not a very good idea, maybe use and the marketing ideas. So what are your three panels idea? Thank you.
They're not arm wrestling over this one. I wonder why.
I'll jump in. I just dealt with this one. China's upset about the idea of carbon tariff.
Yeah.
India is upset about a carbon tariff. I'm sure they've got company. The challenge here is that Americans, and I'm generalizing to an extreme, but Americans are concerned about American jobs and about the climate change making things so expensive in the U.S. that we are forced to buy them from China. So there has been actually some interesting kind of pushback on purchasing solar power panels in the U.S. With consumers going to the companies and saying, are these panels made in China? If so, I don't want to buy them. And this is in part because there's a concern, because of the comments that came out of Suntech saying that they were willing to sell them for less than cost if that meant they could gain market share. But overall, there's a concern that by the U.S. adapting a cap, that we will essentially send our wealth to China. And the U.S. doesn't feel that it should have to, especially right now where so many people are unemployed and the economy is in a tough place. People are afraid that we're going to have to be poor so that China continues economic growth and become wealthy. Congress is then taking that and saying, well, what can we do? How can we come up with a way to reassure Americans that China is not going to be able to continue polluting and taking our jobs without somehow there being a level playing field? And the idea of a carbon tariff is the one that has come as the most logical. Now, I've heard, and I have not seen these studies myself, that actually when you look at the carbon tariff as it's been described in the bills that are currently there in the House and in the Senate, that the tariff actually would have a very minimal effect on China. I don't know what minimal means, but it certainly is worth doing the actual research into it and running the economic analysis to find out how many products and how much of an impact would it have on Chinese exports and Indian exports. The other way to look at it is, okay, we recognize there is a political need for something like this, some way to demonstrate to the American population that climate change bill will not disadvantage them vis-a-vis China. And this is a place where the Chinese themselves can take action. There has been a lot of discussion in China in the past about there being, in intensive industries, they would not get the VAT rebated, or they would have to pay a higher VAT. So there's ways that China itself could actually take some steps to try to prevent a tariff from being in place. I think right now everybody is trying to think of what are the alternatives to a carbon tariff. Or as they call it, a border adjustment mechanism. And I think actually from my sense of talking with different members on the Hill, in the Senate anyway, they're open to some other ideas. But you will not have U.S. climate change legislation without something that helps you address this issue.
I think this is, I don't know how we get through this in Copenhagen. Because there's now text put forward by India and supported by China that there should be no unilateral trade measures, right? I mean, so there's that policy mine, right, heading at each other. And then there's the fact that if we did get through that, I mean, the U.S., let's just put it this way, the U.S. won't be the only ones to put a tariff on the border. I mean, and the U.S. could potentially lose from something like this once China does it, once Europe does it, once... So I think the implications of this type of a mechanism aren't all, the data that you're talking about from the Chinese and Indian perspective is, I think there's quite a lot of research happening there also on the embedded carbon, right? That's been happening at University of East Anglia and some others looking at the embedded carbon that's in the carbon footprint of China and who's responsible for that, right? And I would expect that to come back at the United States and Europe. So it is here to deal, I would say, with the political issue of a few sectors. And in fact, we've done quite a bit of research looking at the imports into the United States on energy intensive goods, and it's not even China that's the real, it's Canada, it's Russia, right? Which gets to this much deeper debate why sessions like this are so important, which is to try and increase understanding between the U.S. and China on these types of issues. But I've been kind of scratching my head very actively on this one going into a Copenhagen negotiation, because if it becomes a bottom line issue for these two blocks, I'm not sure how, I don't see the pathway forward on this yet. And, one would hope, the optimistic would be, okay, you don't get this language in perhaps in the agreement because it's not totally final in Copenhagen. And by June or July, you have U.S. legislation in place, and China has indicated that it is putting in place, which it already has, a number of policies and measures in these key sectors that are of concern. This is kind of more the European approach. And then there's a look at that to say, okay, well, is there a level playing field now? Can we relax this? Can we put it further out in a time period? Can we, change kind of how the U.S. legislation reflects this so that it's not, isn't more certainly than what's in Waxman-Markey right now, and perhaps less, because you've seen that in a global agreement, these energy-intensive sectors are actually going to be dealt with. Those are lots of tea leaves that are being put out there to be read. So I was quite fascinated, actually, when I was in China last to hear about the carbon. I thought first you were asking about carbon taxation debate, and the interest in China to be looking at carbon taxes, partially as a pricing mechanism domestically, but also partially in response to this whole piece. And I was informed that it was a real live debate. And if you can do things like carbon taxation and you can do it right, then you can certainly put in place the incentives and the pricing mechanisms to shift to a lower carbon economy. And it might be a more appropriate policy for China than some others that are more appropriate for the U.S. So it's very interesting.
Two things. One, China has in some of their that with the fuel efficiency standards and that that bigger. It's a lot harder to really more expensive to buy an SUV. Bigger engines are taxed more. They don't call it a carbon tax. Right. Also, because I want to make sure I get that nugget of, and you mentioned how we want to get this kind of message out. What is it that Russia and Canada, what are they importing in here that we?
It's steel, it's aluminum. What are the other? John, do you guys know? Paper.
Steel, aluminum, paper. Okay. I know, we're all about educating.
Check the Level the Carbon Playing Field report.
Tar sands.
All in there.
Tar sands, okay.
Tar sands from Canada.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions. I want burning ones, hot questions in climate change. Do we have something out there? Even my... Oh, here we go. Other panelist.
I wanted to bring the political question for China. That is, what are the coalitions? When we look at climate change questions, anything, if we take carbon tax, if we take certain key policies, typically in most countries there are coalitions on both sides, and there is a confrontation between them, and then typically there is key actors that are tipping the balance one side or the other. Does anyone know how the coalitions look like? There is obviously bureaucratic fights. The Ministry of Environment is weak. SEPA was even weaker before. MOFTEC and other ministries are stronger, so sometimes they win a lot of the battles. Do we know anything about the lineup in the Politburo, or, etc., the State Council? How does it look like politically?
I wouldn't pretend to know the detailed answer to that question, but I would say that the 12th five-year plan takes everything they've done over the past 5 years and basically ratchets it up another level.
Yeah.
The more aggressive efficiency targets, more aggressive renewables targets, ratcheting down the carbon intensity targets, ratcheting down the energy intensity targets per unit of GDP. That's all in there.
And MEP is actually, I think, in there, and also, again, that the plans aren't out yet, but also talk to that not just about the energy intensity, but MEP's really focusing in on the pollutants as well. Let's ride this horse. Even if it makes a big difference for local pollution issues as well. I think one maybe kind of to take your question, kind of modify it slightly. One thing that in the past, and this is for you, that maybe you can help answer this, because we've always talked, the China watchers always talk about how well the domestic energy policies that's a different, the bureaucrats that focus on that are not the same ones that are going to the global climate change talks, and they didn't like them talking to each other. But I have a feeling that wall not as, is it still pretty separate?
It's mixed. I heard even in the context of this recent summit that the NDRC was much more active and ready to move, and the Foreign Affairs Ministry came in and kind of went, so right?
Well,
Go ahead.
I was going to say, there's always a difference, even within NDRC, of those who do sort of more pragmatic cooperation and those that do climate change negotiations, because the Chinese system has always separated out multilateral negotiations from bilateral cooperation, for example. So there is a division. There's some challenges with MFA having a bit of a different agenda and direction of what their interests are. So part of their job is to double check, triple check any agreement, and so they always find something to slow down, just the way our State Department does too. And then there's the different players. What's great though is that at the top level, everybody's on the same page. And they really have, you've seen that become much more streamlined. And even with the SOEs, that would probably count as one of your different coalition blocks. There's been a real movement towards participating and being supportive of these types of goals and agendas.
And I'll add one final comment, is that you also, with, again, I'm always like touting the U.S. NGOs that are going to China, like WRI, that a lot of the WRI, NRDC, and other groups that are going into China, they're working with local governments and trying to do projects that are really working to build the capacity. In some ways, that's kind of like the silent coalition that we're not doing anything before kind of attitude. But you really are seeing, I think, it's encouraging. I mean, there's a lot of naysayers on, where China is on its, in the negotiations. But again, I see there's a lot of promising pilot projects that the international NGOs and the Europeans have been doing there. Again, that's a coalition that I personally am really interested in, that kind of the local governments who ultimately it kind of makes or breaks whether or not they, can really do what they're agreeing to.
I think the only thing I'll add to that is, you hear this, the language that you hear over and over again is the historic and differentiated obligation. That is negotiator language. That is not reflective of what's possible at a sectoral level. I mean, there's a lot you can do, and that China is in fact doing in the sectors that matter. It's pursuing those, as Taiya was saying, through the NDRC. They do the analysis, they realize what they can achieve, they set the targets, they exceed the targets, they ratchet down on them, and they come up with another plan for the next time. And that's actually what we're seeing on the ground. So I think it's really important to recognize that the Copenhagen negotiation it's fundamentally related, but it's also fundamentally dissociated from what you can achieve on the ground. Really, Copenhagen is about a finance mechanism. How do you pay for the carbon that you wouldn't get otherwise from sectoral policy, right? And we know there's a huge amount you can get just with sectoral policy. I think it's on the order of 17, 18, 19 gigatons between now and 2020, just with sectoral policy around the world alone, and a big chunk of that's in China. So it's really important to recognize that what you hear coming from the negotiators, they've got to stake out their turf. China and India are very clear that they're not going to bear the brunt of the expense of a global deal. They're not responsible for historic emissions. This is the language that they use. They want to see the developed world step up to the plate and take responsibility for past actions. I think as soon as you see that happen, they'll rush to the table, I would say is
Yeah, my only slight edit of it's just a financing mechanism is that there is an attempt to have a goal to avoid dangerous climate change.
Thank you very much.
And if we only continue to do what is in countries' national best interest, it won't be enough.
That's right.
So, and that's where the support comes in to try and support China to go bigger, faster, et cetera, or other countries, not just China. So, because otherwise,
thanks for the amendment.
Why even have an agreement?
Okay, I know that I personally, and I do China 24/7. I've learned a lot today from these people, and I want to note that Climate Works. We're getting these movies on little documentaries online, and we're going to keep an eye on how more information that they're generating. I actually neglected to mention that Carnegie, that you all have that big Guangdong initiative, building capacity at local level. Keep an eye on their website, and of course, WRI Facts, new website that just went up.
Yep. One-stop shop.
We help you all a little bit with that.
Yeah, sure did.
I do want to note, too, that just since we're on the climate energy stuff, that the China Environment Forum, that we actually have just been, the Blue Moon Fund informed us that they are going to support us on a project called Cooperative Competitors, where we will be doing more meetings. There's more to be said about energy, I think, as you saw today, in U.S.-China cooperation to get down into the details. So, of course, that grant is just coming online. So I'm thanking the Blue Moon Fund, also my other funders, USAID, Vermont Law School, Western Kentucky University, Center for Global Partnership, Japan Foundation, and Environment Foundation. I'm glad this is the first time I've ever not been able to breathe through all my funders. It's good time. Now, we have some caffeine and sugar outside, which is meant to perk you all back. Not that they were not bored. but to perk y'all back up. But before you go, could we please thank our speakers one more time? Oh, and tomorrow we have a China Environment Forum has a meeting tomorrow morning on environmental health and heavy metal pollution. That's what goes in the water, not hard rock. Thank you.